My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we're having a whale of a time aboard the Leviathan.
Our first segment is Basic Crawl. Leviathan is a 44-page scenario for Classic Traveler, published in 1980 by Games Designers Workshop. It's designed by Bob McWilliams, produced and edited by Albie Fiore, Ian Livingstone, and Andy Slack of Games Workshop Limited. Interior illustrations are by Albie Fiore, page 38, and Russ Nicholson, page 43. Subsector maps and ship plans are by Albie Fiore. The text begins with an introduction. It mentions standards and assumptions and provides some pre-generated stat lines suitable for use in the adventure, and a brief note on how the referee should use the different sections. Then we have a chapter called Situations, where we are given some information about the Barakai Technum, the corporate owners of the starship Leviathan, and their rivals, the McClellan Factors and the Arkesh Spacers. The exploration contract is being offered by Barakai, and reads as such. The essence of the contract is that the Leviathan, an exploratory merchant cruiser, is to be sent on a voyage of no more than 6 months' duration into the Aegean subsector of the Outrim. The voyage must keep clear of the known worlds of the subsector for the sake of secrecy unless a dire emergency develops. The objective is to discover new trading possibilities and to bring back sample trade goods, reports, and survey data. The band are offered positions on board the Leviathan and required to hire on the remaining crew members. Certain crew positions will be filled by BT nominees. The matter of hiring a qualified crew is briefly covered in this chapter as well.
The following chapter is Rumours, where we get a 6x6 table that governs the 26 rumours that the PCs can collect, and their roles on that table are modified by their background and their skills. This is followed by a chapter called The Aegean Subsector, and to quote the text, Aegean Subsector is largely unknown to the public. Most Navy and Scout data on this area is classified. Believed to have been first settled during the Ramshackle Empire era, and since regressed to isolated low-tech societies. There follows the planetary descriptions, the hex map key, basically 6 pages containing each planet's name, a profile covering stats such as its atmosphere, population, and tech level, and then 1 or 2 paragraphs of description for each one. Towards the end of this part, there are ship encounters and the actual hex maps that you use to navigate 2 subsectors of space that pertain to the scenario. There is the safe Pax Rulin area that you set out from, and then the Aegean subsector, the place that is to be explored and rediscovered for commerce. The next section is called the Pax Rulin subsector, and because this is kind of the safe base area, it's just 2 pages that gives you some data on the settled and prosperous worlds of this known area of the Space Empire. The next chapter is called Leviathan-class merchant cruisers, and this is all about your PC ship and its sister vessels. We get 5 pages of quite detailed deck plans, and considerably more pages with written details of each room and the ship's many facilities. Next up is the crew, a roster of 56 people. Positions on the crew and their stats are given, but nothing further. It's intended to be fleshed out when they become important to the story, and of course some of them will be replaced by your player characters anyway, who take those jobs. And then we conclude the book with library data, which is encyclopedia-like information relevant to the scenario from your ship's data tapes. It's that kind of future. To quote the book as well, this is an important note. Library data is information obtainable from any ship's computer in response to the correct keywords. Only the specific information requested should be given to players. And finally, there's a page of referee's notes with suggestions and tips on using this scenario.
Let's talk about how we have used this module in our gaming. I have only read it. Tom?
I ran a 3-hour, maybe a bit longer actually, one-shot, which was online due to the pandemic, using Classic Traveler, using the very stat lines from Leviathan, in fact. I also ran a couple of sessions for my son using a system that loosely resembled Electric Bastion Land, but with this kind of age group it becomes a moot point quite rapidly.
All right, so things we liked about Leviathan. I will say at the outset, just a little caveat. I am not super familiar with Traveller. I know Traveller in a very basic sense from being involved in the role-playing game hobby. But when I was reading this module, because I'm not super well versed in Traveller, I do feel like I was missing some critical context to understanding how the module is supposed to be used and how this is supposed to look and play. And so I want to throw that out there because I do think it's a bit of a caveat on my opinion of the whole proceedings here. I will do my best to be useful, though.
As ever. But yeah, that's actually a good caveat for anyone who might think about just picking up the adventure as well. I think because of its age, there's a certain kind of divergence of paths in history. And I think early Traveller was sort of using some terminology, like we hadn't decided how we were going to describe, making an agility check or something. Like we hadn't in 1980 that wasn't like carved into stone, and the Traveller branch is the stuff that in many, like the terminology, like just saying a throw meaning a die roll, that didn't really make it to today. And so in fact, even now when I was reviewing this for prep for the podcast, because I ran this several months back, I'd already kind of forgotten some of this Traveller stuff, and I was thinking, what does that mean again? What?
Right,
so yeah, it's a little bit of a barrier to entry. But actually, one of the first things I'd like to mention up front here to like about it is it's a historical artifact. It's from the 1980s, 1980. If you're a Traveller enthusiast, it sort of comes from a time before the setting became a fixed big deal. Nowadays, you can go online and there's an interactive hex map of the entire known Traveller world, and all of these planets have been defined into oblivion, and there's a timeline. But this book is actually obsolete in that sense. Like, these planets are described the quote-unquote wrong way. They didn't have that. And this is like maybe the last gasp, only a couple of years after Traveller came out, of the designers originally intended, use this as a toolkit approach. The public kind of wanted to know what's the real deal, what are the facts about this planet, tell us more about the setting. And not being idiots and liking money, GDW went, okay, we'll make those books, that's fine.
Right.
We'll define more and more stuff. Just a bit of a sidetrack, but I think this is one of the... system mastery is a thing that role players like. Setting mastery is the other one that's an odd impulse, but a very understandable one. My most memorable encounter with it was back when I was writing some stuff for Mutant Chronicles. I designed some NPCs that were in a book, and I got an email via the publisher because someone had read this, that he had a question like, about this NPC. You said his wife died on this page, but over here it says he's married. So is she alive or dead? Which is it? Now, what he hadn't considered was option 3, widowed and married again. But what I found interesting was that question, which is it? Well, it's neither, is it? I made it up. So
right, yeah.
But yeah, anyway. So it's interesting from a Traveller history perspective. It's also interesting, a thing I didn't realise until I looked closely at the credits, from a publishing perspective, because this was designed by Games Workshop. Ian Livingstone of Fighting Fantasy fame is in the credits. So this was one of the early days back when they still sold D&D in Games Workshop stores, before they became the lead minis behemoth that we know today. So yeah, it's a good artifact in that sense. Sorry, go on.
I'm glad you say all that, because it makes me feel a little better, because when I was reading the module, I was having a hard time envisioning what I would be doing with it. And I think this relates to my question that I have later on. But even just like the planets, one of the things I did like about the module is there was a great variety of planets. In the 2 subsectors that you're kind of dealing with, there was a nice variety of peoples and cultures and technologies and sort of motivations. And I liked all that. But each planet is maybe 2 paragraphs of description, maybe 1 paragraph. It's very limited. And I had a hard time, kind of understanding, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I was trying to imagine myself GMing it, and I was just having a really hard time imagining, just off of the module, what I was supposed to do. And so that made me think that, well, maybe I just need to know more about Traveller. But it sounds like knowing more about Traveller as it was in 1980 may not have helped me in the way I would have wanted, right?
No, perhaps not. Yeah, it's an odd one because, let's start off with what the structure is. I think it's got a great opening hook. You're joining the ship's crew, great. Mm-hmm. You got to go do exploring, Star Trek style, except it's a bit more like Dune because you want to trade stuff with people and find secret planets that no one else knows about. But yeah, there are some threads of plot, but they're so oblique, it's almost insane. They're buried in the rumours, and some of the planet descriptions kind of pick them up again later. Mm-hmm. So it's a very odd one. I found in play that to be honest, because when you do a one-shot, I think that's the kind of thing that would come out in 2 or 3. It didn't really come out that well. The planet descriptions, those were the real meat of the adventure. Like, you find a thing you can trade for, and then the first couple of planets are not that interesting, quote unquote interesting. You show up, survey them, meet the people if they're there, and then you move on quite quickly because it becomes interesting by planet 3, right? Where the crew start to think, oh, if we combine the stuff that planet A wants with the deadly rivalry between the factions on planet B, and then go to planet C, and they've got that other thing that can be traded, and then they start to come up with cunning plans, and then that's when the sandbox kind of becomes a proper play area. But yeah, the individual planets are sort of, there's almost nothing to them, which is kind of weird. And actually, that you can overlook it, but the bit in the back with the random ship encounters actually is very important as well, because that's where the rival corporations show up, and they don't really appear anywhere in the fixed locations. But yeah, it's an odd one. When you look at it, it's sort of like basically someone just pre-rolled a bunch of planets, which I think is probably what they did off the random tables in Traveller, and then tried to explain it in advance for you.
Yeah. I did find myself a little alienated from this book as I was reading it for reasons I've already mentioned. I will say, though, that in addition to the variety of planets, I also thought the rumors were really good. I think they were presented in a way that was quite dry and maybe not the most exciting thing in the world, but there was a good variety of rumors, and there was a lot of potential story hooks there. I think, depending on kind of what your characters are interested in doing and what you roll in that fabulously complicated rumor die roll thing.
The weird thing about that rumor thing is it's not that complicated. It's a D66 table. Why did they explain it in such a weird way?
I know. And I'm keeping that on my chain lightning, by the way.
Okay, that's fine.
Because I actually do love it in a sort of perverse way.
Yeah, it's just, what are they doing? Oh,
the rumors that are good. I mean, the planets seemed cool. I love the presentation of everything. I think the artwork, there's only 2 pieces of artwork. They're good. But really, truly, the maps and stuff, that's all really nicely presented. There's a lot to like here. It just feels, I don't even think skeletal is the right word. It feels just very thin in terms of stuff. It does. And when you do the incredibly basic research. It somehow feels thin.
Yeah,
considering how much is there.
Yeah, and that's why I'm sort of weirdly fascinated by the historical context as well, because if you look at the reviews this got when it came out, people were blown away. Like, this is the best travel adventure yet. And,
Right.
I mean, having played it a couple of times, we had a good time, but I struggled to put myself in the shoes of those reviewers. But I'm not
in
here
a different era.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think there's a lot of stuff in here that we now have rediscovered. I think we'll come back to talk about that later. But certainly, there are really good ideas in here, and it's well designed in a minimal way, if that makes sense. It points you in the right directions. For example, let's get back onto things we like. One of the bits I really like is the opening, which is when you get hired to be on this ship, they kind of just want you to assign jobs to yourselves. Who's going to be the captain? Who's going to be the navigator? The weapons officer? The engineer? Okay, there's a couple of good things here. Firstly, in Traveller, the way the skills work, and because of the sort of hard sci-fi-ish, space opera-ish setting it is, you could literally say in character, why, yes, as it happens, I am rated level 2 at navigation. And so, the other thing is, it's not like those conversations you have in a lot of RPGs where it's, oh, do you want to drive the tank and I'll fire the laser gun? It's literally, they've got requirements for each job. Like, if you want to be the navigator, you've got to be this good at computers, this good at navigating, and so on. And, your player characters are almost certainly, there's going to be at least, I'd say, 3 who are going to have different combinations, that they could each do at least 2 of those jobs, and they have to kind of talk about the assignments. And then later in the adventure, I'm pretty sure someone got reassigned because they realized it wasn't working. And it was very interesting because it's like a way of, we've talked before about how there are not many adventures or games that give you a sense of being a crew rather than a gang of dilettantes.
That's true, yeah.
But this sort of did, because you literally get to know each other's competencies straight away because you're talking about it. And then they have to hire on the rest of the crew. I did not go through the rigmarole they suggest of actually doing job interviews.
Yeah.
But I think what I would do if I were running it for longer is I would use that bit. And when we introduce, someone from that crew roster, we'd have a flashback to the job interview.
I like that.
Do that bit. Like, why did you hire this guy exactly? And they'll be, well, he had a jaunty hat or something. And
right.
I think that would be good.
It's funny because what you just said about the way that your characters have to actually be qualified to do the thing, you know? It really is it's an interesting artifact from a sort of roots of the hobby standpoint, because the roots of the hobby are being rooted in wargaming. There is just this simulationist impulse that is just dominant in role-playing games at this time. And this Traveler module, Leviathan, when it comes to the ship at least, the planets might be sketchy, but boy, the ship is not.
Ooh, no.
The ship is not sketchy at all. That actually kind of goes into one of the things that I liked about the module, although it took me a minute to get there. I had to think about the ship quite a bit. There's a lot of word count given over to the ship. And listeners, I can't overstate how incredibly detailed it is in terms of the various like spaces, the various like guns. There's so many numbers. My head was spinning as I was reading through it.
Yeah.
I initially had a hard time seeing the point of this amount of detail because of the kind of gamer I am and because it's the year 2021. I thought it was very, very dry, and I couldn't find much like quote unquote plot going on in this part of the module. But the more I thought about it, it occurred to me that this ship, Leviathan, is meant to be like the city or the home base of a long campaign of Traveler. And so it's detailed in the way that you would want a city to be detailed if you were going to have like a city home base in your fantasy game. So I kind of got on board with it at that point once I sort of like made that little, once that kind of clicked into my head. But it's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail in there. I will confess, I barely read that stuff. I just thought, do you know what? This is the player characters' business, so I gave them the deck plans and the descriptions. And if they wanted to make their way from, like, I don't know, Missile Bay A up to the lifeboats or something, I would ask them what the problem was with that, if any. But yeah, it really sells the idea of the selling point is in the title, Leviathan, right? You're in command of something big. You're not just in some dinky Firefly style, just big enough for a group of D&D PCs thing. And there's a lot of business about who's where on the ship, or you start to do that once you've got a big deck plan. And it really does feel solid and significant, the decisions that you start to make. What I'd compare it to, I think, is the very old early XCOM games where you got to kind of design your base. I don't know if you remember this. If you upgraded, you bought like a new aircraft hangar or another dormitory, you'd place it on the map. But then, spoilers for a game that came out in 1995, after a while of annoying the aliens by shooting down their flying saucers, they would attack your base. So this place you'd become so familiar with, like placing the things and kind of learning the way around, suddenly it becomes the battlefield. And actually, I think in Leviathan it would be really cool to have just have a boarding action after about, let's say, session 5, once everyone knows their way around. That would be great. And of course, people's prized possessions getting shot up in the crossfire. But yeah, it gives that sense of solidity to it. The dryness, I think, is part of that.
Yeah.
You feel serious and competent when you're dealing with these things.
Yes, it definitely comes across as the sort of thing that is probably much different in play than it is to just read it. A read is not the most enjoyable thing in the world.
No.
But, anything else you want to say that you liked about Leviathan before we move on?
The very brief paragraph descriptions, I think what's an important thing to know going into this is that I think you need to be prepared, especially if you're being the GM or the referee, as Traveller calls it. Be prepared for a zoomed out play, which is to say there are some of those write-ups where you could show up on a little planet and do some kind of moment by moment exploration and discovery in a classic D&D style. But for many of them, you can pretty much read out the whole description and then say, and what do you do? And then the players start, forming a delegation to the land yacht barons that they know about, and they go down to trade for reptile livestock or what have you. Like, we've talked in the past about just giving out all the information and then seeing what they do with it. That's what you have to do with this, right? You can't. There's no point like having a scene where they land and then they see a big land yacht. Like, you might do some of that as describing how they find it out, but eventually you've got to cut to the chase and say, these are the guys. Some of them live on the lakes. Some of them live over here. The thing you are here to do is to kind of make big decisions, and then zoom in on the actual details once it becomes a sticking point. It caters to that pretty well. It doesn't really flag at all which is which, though. So you have to,
right, yeah.
you got to kind of look at the planet and think, okay, what is the next scene here? But hey, that's why you're making the big GMing bucks, I guess. Yeah.
Well, shall we go to questions?
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you start then?
Okay, my first question is one of those leading questions that's basically a statement, is wouldn't this benefit from having its hidden plot threads just called out and labelled the same way Times That Fry Men's Souls does?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think the whole module would benefit from some sort of variation in layout.
Yeah, that's true as well. Yeah.
If you just look at it without reading anything, it's like stereo instructions. I mean, it's very big blocks of text with not much help given to the reader. And so, yes, I agree with this completely. Just from a sort of information management standpoint, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
My question is, okay, this kind of goes back to my thing of like, I don't really understand Traveler. So the players decide they want to land on, say, Glisten, which is one of the planets. What do you do then? Is there like support anywhere else in the Traveler rules about what you're supposed to do as the GM? Like, what is the next thing?
Yeah, there is. So, I mean, Classic Traveller is oddly sort of PBTA-ish in some ways. So, like the skill write-ups are sort of, when you attempt to demolish something, do blah, blah, blah. And then in the game running section, it's a bit like that as well. So it does have procedures for, skimming fuel from a gas giant for your spacecraft and landing and looking around and famously trying to get a job. So I think it's a 1 in 6 chance every week of finding a patron. But yeah, it has all those bits.
Okay.
And they intersect in that kind of, the same way that in your Fantasy Vietnam OSR dungeon crawls, that 1 in 6 random monster encounter is there to put time pressure on you and make you decide how long you want to spend doing something. It kind of has the same thing as that, with space and food and whatnot. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, let's do the chain lightning round. This is one of the rumors, I believe. This laboratory assistant recalls being on a botanical research vessel which called at Wale, doing work on plant life in corrosive atmospheres. He mentions that a couple of field collectors died on the planet. The inhabitants live in sealed domes. He doesn't recommend the place.
The credits name 2 illustrators and follow each name with a page number. Yes, this is a scenario containing precisely 2 illustrations, but they are both quite good.
Alluded to earlier, quite possibly the best piece of writing in any role-playing game thing I've ever read, is how you roll dice on the rumor table.
You can read all of this.
I am, strap in.
Oh.
The rumor table is a 6x6 matrix calling for 2 separate die rolls. The 36 locations in the table contain 26 items, letters matching the 26 distinct rumors given in this section. 6 of the rumors, lettered U to Z, are of a general nature and appear more than once. The remaining 20, lettered A to T, are specific and appear only once each. Die roll modifications are called for, which make certain rumors more probable to persons with specific qualities or experiences. Thus, a scout will more probably encounter some rumors, while a noble will more probably encounter others. After a throw indicates that a rumor is encountered, roll 2 dice, modify by the nature of the leader of the group, and determine which rumor should be relayed to the party. Modifications to the horizontal die are based on naval and scout service. If the leader of the party is a former scout, apply a DM of -1. If prior experience was in the Navy, apply a DM of +1. Modifications to the vertical die roll are based on social standing. If the leader of the party is noble, social standing of 11+, apply a DM of +1. If the individual has a skill of streetwise, -1 or better, apply a DM of -1. Throws on the rumor table of less than 1 equal 1, throws greater than 6 equal 6. And we wonder why role-playing games have never penetrated into mainstream popularity.
I'm just wondering which part of Chain Lightning this applies to. Okay, my next one. The description of the Arkesh Spacers. They are a frankly predatory outfit on the thin line between accepted commercial practice and outright piracy.
Bennett Lyda Santos, a gentleman explorer and rogue of the mercantile persuasion. I just like that little... A rogue of mercantile persuasion.
This eminent zoologist, age 62, is willing to pay 5,000 credits for a living specimen of any unknown carnivore delivered to him in a healthy state.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. So Tom, why don't you give us the premise of what we're going to be doing? I'm going to tell you why I'm skeptical, and then you're going to prove me wrong. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Oh, as long as the last part comes off okay, otherwise this is going to be very unpleasant. Okay, no. The strapline for today's Expert Delve is A World Without Dungeons, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Random Tables. So let me explain how this all came about. Before I was running Leviathan, I wanted to try running Classic Traveller. Had played it before, but many years before. And when I flipped through the book, let's just put it this way, much as you may have found the layout and information design a little tough to handle in Leviathan, I sort of had the same problem with Traveller's Little Black Books. It's not that they were badly done, it's just they were kind of limited in what they could produce at the time. Long story short, I felt like I had to run it to kind of understand it, and I ended up doing a little, just a private Discord channel to myself, doing a kind of journaling game with 3 characters. I decided to do it exactly as it's written, which is quite different. So basically, people think about Traveller, they think about being in a merchant ship, travelling from planet to planet. That's not what really happens if you actually follow the random tables you get. For a start, you probably don't have a spaceship at all when you start. Secondly, you can kind of mooch around planet-side for quite a long time and never meet anyone who owns a spaceship that they want you to go on either. Or even if you do, like, they're not going to give it to you and let you fly it around. I ended up with a storyline about going to a science colony thing in the mountains and getting ambushed by bandidos and whatnot that I don't think I would have come up with by myself if someone had said, write a short story set in the Traveller universe. Yeah, I got this interesting, slightly orbital bluesy, melancholy game about demobbed drifters and ex-soldiers and so on. And I thought this was very interesting, and it sort of showed me, well, something that I sort of know anyway, like from doing things like Apocalypse World, more of which are non, which is that if you think about the classic D&D model, it's travelling across country, which is more abstract. You've got the town, the wilderness, the destination dungeon, and that's all kind of just some random rolls, and you'll meet interesting NPCs maybe on the way, get attacked by hyena men, what have you. But no one's really knows exactly what's going to happen in advance for that. It throws a spanner in the works, even for the GM, who sort of gets to be surprised. And then when you get to the dungeon, the GM's been there before. The players are exploring things, and they're not. And I realised that you don't need the dungeon bit. Much like people enjoy roguelike games, you can actually have a pretty good time. It's a very different kind of story, and it's more like that kind of fantasy non-fiction, as I'm still trying to popularise. But yeah, you get this you get these picaresque tales that start to generate their own continuity and have these emergent properties like discussed in the sandbox of Leviathan. And yeah, I think it's a pretty good time. And please deconstruct my premise now.
Well, I mean, I actually am with you in spirit on this.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like what you're basically saying is there is something pleasurable, and indeed it's a good alternative to scenarios to just have like tables that you roll on randomly to see what happens, and then we sort of improvise the adventure or whatever from there, right? Is that kind of basically what we're getting at here?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's improvising the adventure, because there is a degree to which it's not improvised, right? Someone designed those tables, or
fair. That's true.
That's
true.
Someone set the parameters.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's the players picking what they're doing, and then only going into a dungeon if they happen to, for some reason, have a reason to want to bust into the evil wizard's lair and head downstairs. So yeah, that kind of thing, and it gives you these sort of quite organic things.
I think I just have very conflicted feelings about the premise because on the one hand, my own design work exists in this space a little bit because I create mystery games whereby the GM doesn't know the solution. The GM gets to be surprised, much in the same way in your setup here. The GM gets to be kind of surprised by what happens on the adventure because we're just rolling on tables. And so I am spiritually aligned with this idea. I think my skepticism of it is rooted in, well, a few different things. I mean, and I should mention that my skepticism is more like, it's a skeptical approach for like me. I'm not even thinking this is like generally applicable, right? But like for me and people like me, I'm skeptical. When I ran Yunsuin, for example, I picked things from the tables ahead of time and then tailored my prep to that, right? Because I still wanted to do prep. I had half a session where I just rolled on the tables to see what would happen, as Yunsuin wants you to do. but I wasn't super satisfied with the outcome. It felt a little too higgledy-piggledy and not particularly coherent. And I felt a little bit like GMing in that style for me felt a little bit too much like just trying to hold on while the cart is flying off the rails. Like it kind of had that feeling to me. I think I just like a little bit more control in my GMing. Gardens of Yin is a great example here. I think Gardens of Yin is a really cool concept. I love its sort of assertive, like, roll on tables as you go to figure out what's going on sort of approach. I've played it a few times now, and it has a lot to recommend it. It's super cool. But that sort of rolling on the tables in the moment thing, every time saps the momentum of the story. And so that's another aspect of it that I kind of, there's another like where my skepticism is kind of rooted. There's also just a sort of like big picture thing of like, I have played with GMs who are very loud or insistent that they never prep for a session. Like, I never prep for a session. I just sit down and do it. And let me tell you, I can always tell they never prep for their session. It's just not as good. I'm sorry. It's just not as good. There are obviously very good improvisational GMs out there, but I think even improvisational GMs should prep something. There should be a little bit of prep.
Well, see, I think that's where we kind of agree, because I'm not saying don't do prep. I'm just saying consider doing more of this prep. And it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the rolling in the moment. It's noteworthy, I think, that even by the time of Leviathan, a scarce few years into Traveller's existence, the introduction already says, you're going to want to use these other supplements we do, such as 1001 NPCs who've been pre-generated, and you just pick. And there's also that interesting philosophical thing, like, what's the real difference between making something up 5 minutes in advance and the day before? And like some people are quite vehement about that. I'm curious about your Yunsuin experiment with randomness. When you say you rolled it, do you mean you like rolled it, for example, the day before and then tried to make it into a thing? Or were you rolling it at the table?
I did both. I sort of started with just rolling in the moment, did not like it. And then for the rest of the sessions, I rolled ahead of time and sort of did my normal prep, but just using details rolled from the table. I took away the sort of like in the moment quality. And so I don't know. I don't know if I may not even be making a distinction with what you're saying here. I might be kind of projecting too much onto what you're saying as far as like how on the fly this is, right? But yeah, that's kind of what I did.
Yeah, it's not necessarily. I think you can and should vary how on the fly it would be. So anything that you'll find boring or tedious at the table, I would say do in advance. But having said that, I am a bit of an advocate, as you know, Jason, of slow gaming, and I think one of the most valuable kind of GMing lessons that I ever kind of got was from my good friend Stuart, who. He used to live in Hong Kong as well, and I remember one of the first times he was being our GM. I forget what we were playing. I'm going to assume it was Monster Hearts because that's a decent stab in the dark. And I had said my character was going to do something. I forget what, doesn't matter. And Stuart just kind of sat quietly, looked down at his hands in his lap, and I was sitting there thinking, what's happening here? He's not saying anything, because normally GMs are just constantly talking. The goal is always to be like instant response. Yeah, I was prepared for that. I know what to do. But in fact, if someone does this, that's showing you tremendous respect, right? Because they're taking the time to think about what you've just said and what's the best thing to do next. And yeah, man, just like take that quiet break. We'll wait. The players will wait for you to think about what you're going to do next. And sometimes you just have to take a break. But yeah, like this, you do have to go a bit slower if you're doing this. I would suggest you want a game where things happen in a more contemplative way, such as, for example, Traveller, where you're often talking about, well, we've got to take 2 days to transit from this orbit to over there. And so things will feel a bit more stately, and you can kind of build in that problem of time management into the feel of the game, if that makes sense, yeah.
I'm about to contradict some of what I just said based on what you just said.
Right.
I'm not totally opposed to what you're saying here, obviously. One of the things that I love about Trophy, for example, is the high degree of player authorship that happens in the game that is indeed mechanically enforced by the game leads to sort of the GM needing to be able to adapt and reincorporate on the fly. It's almost like picking something from a table, except it's even more on the fly and improvisational because you didn't know it was on the table because there was no table.
Yeah.
It's just like people, giving input. I think the reason why that works for me better is because the very like intensely collaborative nature of those games, of the Trophy games and other games like it, it means that there's like kind of something going on at the table. Everyone's like kind of chatting, even if it's out of character, and kind of getting to a good story point. Whereas like in Gardens of Yin, when we're waiting on the GM to roll on the table and figure out what it all means, we're all just kind of sitting there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that's kind of where that momentum thing comes from for me. So like I said, I have really conflicted feelings about this whole topic. I think it's probably just a type of gaming I need to do more often. I want to hear make your case here. Like, I know you got a lot of notes here, so let's go through it.
Yeah, I sort of, well, you say notes, there's sort of things I dropped into Google Keep over the last week, and do they make any kind of structure? Let's find out. I think there are a couple of what you could call arguments for it, like deciding to be more random table-y might be two main reasons to do it. The first is kind of the argument from art, which is going to sound, it sounds highfalutin, but bear with me. So just the other day, I was listening to Laurie Anderson, she of Oh Superman fame, doing an interview on the Adam Buxton podcast, and he mentioned this quote from David Bowie, where he'd said that he knew a song was done when he could no longer detect his own hand in it.
That's interesting.
And they talked for a while about this idea of artists trying to remove themselves from the equation to create something that is beyond themselves. And oddly enough, there's a quote from Mark Miller from some years ago where he talks about why the random planet generation tables in Traveller exist. And he said it's because, let's play this game, you're the referee. Think of a cool alien planet. Easy. It's awesome. Now think of another one. That's also great. Okay, now think of another one. Keep doing it for do 30 more planets. Eventually, you're going to just fall into a rut that's inside your own mental space, your experiences. And that is where that's why random tables and odd combinations come up. They're like Brian Eno's oblique strategy cards, which I think makes Mark Miller Brian Eno in this analogy. Further research needed on that. So, as an example, there's this planet in Leviathan that doesn't make any sense on the face of it. It's called Vior. It's on page 14. I checked it just before we started. Mm-hmm. And the problem there is, and I noticed this just as my players were heading for it in their starship, which is that it's got no atmosphere, yet it has a low tech level and there are people living on it. What's that about? So I think what I might have done was done the strategic coffee break at that point and given it some thought. And I remembered a short story I'd read many years ago, which I now know the identity of and will reveal later during Companion Adventures. So I started describing this thing where this is one of the more D&D-ish planets, right? So we had the thing of landing at a bunker door and going in and finding cloths hung across the corridors, layer after layer of cloth. And it turned out it was trapping oxygen inside these caves, which was scooped off from the frozen, like they get buckets of solid oxygen, snow from the planet's surface, bring it inside, and it melts and gives you breathable oxygen, which is ripped off from this 1950s sci-fi story I read. Mark Miller, in an interview in an old gaming magazine, possibly Space Gamer, had done exactly the same thing. He talked about running Leviathan and remembering this story. So, of course, that's sort of halfway between the two things. It's triggering something you didn't think of originally, but it's also just kind of drawing out memories of something that you couldn't access until you get this one trigger of randomness, of a thing that doesn't make sense. Whereas if you were designing that, you might just go, no atmosphere, low tech, doesn't make any sense, forget it. But if you're sort of forced to by the fact of it being there, then you have to do it. So that's a really good thing about it, this way of removing yourself. And then the other thing is, as we've alluded to, this sort of argument of it just being a different kind of game.
Right. In
the same way that, Trophy or Brindlewood Bay are different to GM because you get to be surprised by things that happen in different ways because of the authorship the players have. In this way, you get to sort of be discovering the world in some aspects at about the same speed the players do.
Right.
Which is fun. You're all in it together. You get this picaresque journey. And it is a bit like, I've mentioned roguelikes or cooperative board games, where it's you all, not against the world, but discovering what's going to happen next.
Right,
so, and still expecting certain levels of things. Oddly enough, I wonder if I'm sort of framing this as like the classic GM and players group. I think I might really be recommending this in the vein of the current vogue for journaling games and maybe PvPs, because I think that slower pace is...
Well, the slower pace is going to help, right?
Yeah, is maybe what you want to do. But I found it's been something I've been doing a bit more deliberately, or rather just incorporating more than I would as a percentage of the content into games I've been running. And it's going okay. 7 out of 10. Keep it, still trying. But
Right, yeah.
I think it's like an extra arrow in your gaming quiver.
I'm coming around on this. I mean, I think I do not game like this much. You know, if I'm thinking back on Yunsuin, which is like the time I tried this, right? That was a long time ago, probably like 5 or 6 years ago for one thing. But also, and so I probably had like a different sort of skill set as a GM even back then, right? Or even that relatively recently. But I think that like what I would probably do differently in order to make it a little bit more of like a comfortable thing for me as a GM is to just do the things that like the games that I like, that I design or publish or whatever, like that do the things I want them to do. I can just kind of like informally incorporate that stuff into the process. Like there's no reason why we can't roll a thing. It's some weird ass detail that I didn't anticipate. And I just turn it over to the players and say, what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I do that a lot.
You can totally
actually,
do that, right?
What's up with this?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of our Apocalypse World principles. I think it just kind of comes down to like me needing to sort of reframe the style of play slightly so that it kind of fits more with my style of play.
Yeah.
And then I still get all the benefits of like the sort of surprise of the tables, the fun of the tables. Look, tables are fun.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there's no getting around that. I don't run games using them a lot, but I love to read them. Tables are fantastically inspirational. A lot of times it's stuff that won't ever come up in the game, but just their existence creates inspiration for you as the GM and is in the back of your mind, right? Like it's there to be grabbed onto in some other context. And so tables are great. Tables are fun. I think there's just a sort of like slight reframing of like expectations and procedure for me.
Yeah, if you like PBTA games, I think you probably like this, especially if it's in the... I mean, I'm an Apocalypse World guy, I've got to say, and not so much a Monster of the Week guy. And I think that's probably the difference, isn't it? Is that the lack of structure is actually what I like about it.
Interesting.
But yeah, principles and player and GM moves, I think that's a great thing to have for this kind of play. Because it's another way of like forcing yourself to do things differently. I was going to suggest some things to watch out for and ways to make this kind of work as well from my experience. I think the strongest thing you can do is to reincorporate. So that's a classic improv thing. So, you know, the second time you roll Space Bandits, it's probably a pretty good idea if they're either are the same ones that you met earlier or if they're the enemies of the ones you met earlier. Some kind of relationship so that gives you more things that the players can interact with. They're not just like siloed off little encounters. Yeah, quick plug for my game Revolution Comes to the Kingdom, which features reincorporation as
it's fabulous,
a little subsystem.
Yeah, it's very good.
Okay.
Go back it on Patreon now.
Oh dear. So, man, I think I've covered all the other stuff I was going to suggest, and then I kind of have a sort of suggested procedure for startups, but I'm not going to go into it now because we talked for too long. TLDR of it is go read Apocalypse World, do that. But with random tables. Frame things nicely and yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. I'm glad we landed on that place because honestly, this is what Fear of a Black Dragon is, correct? I mean, this is what we've been saying from day one in this podcast, which is role-playing game design schools, these sort of design movements, these sort of scenes are so much more similar than we think often. They have so many more similarities and there's so many places where they connect up. And I think this is a really good place where they connect up. Tables are always great. You know, they are useful in every type of gaming, and no matter what type of gaming you do, even if you prefer the sort of more collaborative kind of story game type stuff that I prefer.
Yeah, that's the thing, man. I do love story gaming, but I'll tell you what, there's something that you can't get in something that's a more narratively or creatively player designed outcome, whereas compared to if we roll a 1 on this d6, one of us is going to die because we know what the table is and we know what we're rolling on. But that's how you get character-driven stuff in games like Traveller or OSR games or whatever, because that's the only way to be brave is to actually be in danger. And that, I think, is the real charm of something like this, where a fixed table or a known probability like has real teeth to it.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting sort of other side of the coin. Yeah, I like that.
Exactly.
It's good.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Anything else you want to say? This was surprisingly non-controversial. I thought we were going to really go at it here in the beginning.
No. I mean, we could do a retake where we argue more, but otherwise, let's call it a day.
Let's call it a day. It's the companion adventures. Tom, go ahead.
For some reason, the first thing on my list is a film from 1982 It's called First Blood, and it stars Sylvester Stallone.
I was surprised by this choice. Yeah,
yeah, but I was talking about the sort of the non-spaceship traveller. If you use the actual tables, this is a film about a demobilized soldier doing a hex crawl, and he has a random encounter with local law enforcement. Things get out of hand. So yeah,
well, that's pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, like that.
How about you, Jason?
I'm going to say Battlestar Galactica, the one from 2004, which is a wonderful show, and you should watch it for any number of reasons. But one of the things that the show does really, really well is it shows shipboard life. I say this as somebody who used to be in the Navy, and I don't think there's a show, there's ever been a show that shows what it's like to be in the United States Navy as good as Battlestar Galactica, right? Which is which is a science fiction show that doesn't have anything to do with Earth in the beginning. Spoiler alert for old ass show. But the thing is, though, no, it's a great example of like shipboard life, and I actually think you should watch something like this before you start doing a campaign with Leviathan. I really do. Like, it feels like you want this in your toolkit. Yeah,
that's a great recommendation. What else do I have? Oh, the story that I mentioned, that is A Pail of Air by Pail as in a bucket. A Pail of Air by Fritz Leiber. I never remember which one is the correct one for this. I was published in 1951, but it's in all kinds of collections. Oh, I also want to mention there's a blog called Tales to Astound. If you Google that and then look for the tag Traveller Out of the Box, I've completely forgotten the author's name, but he did a whole bunch of posts about exactly this thing of trying to play Traveller just using the original books, and one of those RAW experiments, and it's really interesting. So I recommend giving that a read. You've got some game recommendations, Jason?
I do, yeah. I was just thinking that you might want to have a sort of traveler type experience, but with a lighter system. And part of my remit, at least here on the show, is to share those systems with you. And so I'm going to suggest Impulse Drive, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game that is, it seems like basically like a Traveler or Mass Effect type game, but using PBTA mechanics. And Offworlders, that actually has some light PBTA stuff in it as well, because it's kind of mostly based off World of Dungeons. But Offworlders I've played quite a few times, and it's good. It's really, really light, but you still get that sense of like going to different planets and things. And I think that's kind of what you want in something like this.
Nice. Yeah, I had a few games on the list. Well, one of them was Apocalypse World, so let's take that as read. Also, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire by Tim Hutchings. I mean...
Oh, for the journaling aspect, yeah.
For the journaling, and also it's a selection of random encounters. And another one that works really well on this home base plus exploring and having random stuff happen to you is Mutant Year Zero, which is a kind of post-apocalyptic game. It does also have a sort of ongoing plot thing that you can also use, but the basic game is just this kind of building up your colony and exploring the ruins, and that works mostly really well, but with some caveats for certain character types. But definitely worth a look. Anyway, I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. If you love this show, please go support The Gauntlet on Patreon, because that is how the show gets made. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to our extra-solar editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners. Take care.
Bye. The Between is coming. The Between is a tabletop role-playing game about a group of mysterious monster hunters in Victorian-era London. These hunters learn about monsters and killers throughout the city and conduct investigations or hunts in order to neutralize them. Over time, they become aware of the plans of a criminal mastermind who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. They will eventually be forced to confront this criminal mastermind in order to save Queen and Country. The Between is directly inspired by the TV show Penny Dreadful, but also takes inspiration from British horror classics, the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, pulp-era media, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and from Hell. The Between comes with the core rules, 7 playbooks, 9 scenarios or threats, a mastermind sheet, reference sheets, and a supplement called London at Night, The Unseen. You'll be able to get The Between in PDF form via the Gauntlet Patreon in late May. Just go to patreon.com/gauntlet. The Between will be available on DriveThruRPG in June. Can you hear the footsteps in the shadows? Can you smell the metal tang of blood on the air? Can you feel the veil between worlds slipping away with each heartbeat? It's London calling.